Welcome, everyone, and welcome back to returning students, faculty, and staff. This is a tremendous pleasure to welcome you all to the fall semester in the School of Architecture, and also other friends and colleagues in other units in the college. Thank you so much for joining us. We're a little bit tight here. I can feel some air. I think that's good. I was a little worried the temperature would continue to rise in the building, but hopefully things will cool down. There are some extra seats kind of interspersed if folks need a seat, or maybe folks on the end can kind of tighten up in case we have some latecomers. But welcome, everyone. My name is Blaine Brownell. I'm the director of the School of Architecture. I sometimes forget to mention that, especially for those who don't know me yet. I'm thrilled to be presenting one of the first lectures I've given in this space. I'm actually not the one giving the lecture. I'm giving the convocation talk, but at least to introduce in this space because we've had a couple of years. In fact, I heard from Liz. She said she has some students returning students, some of you who haven't been on campus before. So it's just so wonderful to be with you in person and to welcome you in person. I will be very brief because I have the pleasure of introducing your dean and his talk today. And then after his talk, we'll have a panel session that faculty member Liz McCormick has organized with 5 of our star students here in the front row. I've heard they're even coming up on stage, which is very exciting. So you can see them and hear them. So they will ask questions of Brook and be in dialogue with Dean Muller. And after that, we will have some slides talking about upcoming events and things that are happening this year in the School of Architecture and beyond. So I'm super excited to talk about those things as well. It's a great pleasure and honor to introduce our dean. Dean Muller made a joke yesterday's event that he met a student who asked what a dean was. And he said, that's a good question. So as the leader of our college, I think most of us know him primarily for his role as dean, as the leader of our college. But of course, he also has a very wide-ranging and colorful and interesting research and scholarship dimension to the things that he does that we don't necessarily get to know about. And so, and he'll also talk about this year's lecture series, which is something that we discussed having this year is really being important to look more deeply at climate change and its various impacts, including issues of social justice, et cetera. So he'll talk more about that and contextualize his particular talk along those lines. So as you all know, Brook Muller is Dean of the College of Arts and Architecture. Before joining us here, he directed the University of Oregon Portland Architecture program. He was on the architecture faculty there. His research and practice focus is on how site-scale works of architecture can support broader scale ecological processes and the design implications of resilient urban water systems, something that's ever more important today. Brook entered academia from practice. After he earned his Master of Architecture degree from the University of Oregon, he worked for the award-winning and premier firm of Banish and Partners Architects in Stuttgart, Germany. And one of the project examples from his career there, he was co-leader on the design of the IBN Dutch Institute for Forestry and Nature Research, a European Union pilot project for sustainable design. Brook authored Ecology and the Architectural Imagination in 2014. He's written a number of articles, published in a number of journals, but his latest book project in particular, Blue Architecture, Water, Design, and Environmental Futures, is something that he'll focus on today. And that was published by the University of Texas Press in May of this year. Thing here to add about blue architecture. Taking inspiration from vernacular examples, Brook proposes a hydrological philosophy, and that's hydro logical philosophy in which architects and planners begin by conceptualizing interactions between existing waterways and the spaces they intend to develop. From these interactions and the new technologies and approaches that enable them, aesthetic, spatial, and experiential opportunities follow. In this way, Blue architecture aims to change the way we think about our designed world. Please join me in welcoming Brook Muller.
Thank you, Ben. Well, thank you. I've always wanted to come to Charlotte. I really appreciate the invitation. I've heard great things about the school. Oh, wait, sorry. So thank you very much. And so this is a lecture in two parts. So Blue architecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about my book. And I've shared some of this with some of you before, so I hope it's not redundant. But I do think the first day of the semester, and given some recent events, it would be helpful to look at some of this. And then I'm going to talk about evolutionary urbanism, and I'll explain what that means and how I think it links. It's one suggestion for how we think about the notion of drawdown and curating urbanisms in the drawdown, which is the theme for the series this year. So Paul Hawken is an environmentalist, and he edited the book called Drawdown. And he basically says, here are the 100 things that we need to do very quickly to ameliorate the worst of climate change impacts. So it's a call to action and specific things we could do. But what I'm going to suggest is it's also almost philosophically a characterization of where we are in this moment when we think about climate change, rapid urbanization, diaspora, inequality, ecosystem degradation, and water problems everywhere. But the premise of Blue architecture, water is marginalized in design, architectural design, and it's a really great design protagonist. It's a great way to inspire your design thinking. And it's also inherently connective. That's the beauty of it. So thinking about relationships between buildings and landscapes, it helps us think about what those relationships are, such that the moves we make at the building scale can support landscape processes and the other way around. And again, with respect to all these challenges that we're facing, what of the idea of architecture as ecological infrastructure? What about the idea of architecture delivering net positive watershed impact? So it's one means to address these multiple interrelated challenges. And I would say everywhere I go in the world, there's a water crisis. And it's different crises in different places: water quality, scarcity, too much, like Dallas, Texas last night, when it rained 8 inches and people had to swim from their cars to safety. That's an increasingly normal circumstance. Oops, that's not working. Uh-oh. Todd, it's not forwarding. What's that? I didn't touch that. Okay. So I'm sure you've read about what's going on in the American Southwest right now. The Hoover Dam, the reservoir is at an all-time low. If it goes just a little bit lower, they're going to have to cut off supply. And so it's a choice between cities and agriculture. What do you choose? This is a major situation. Really great book on this topic, by the way. But you have so many straws in that river, these cities that are growing like Phoenix, LA, and Las Vegas, and others. And several years of drought, and this is the prediction on into the future. And they're confronted with some really very challenging choices to make. One of the problems is that people of European descent went west, they settled the West in a way that John Wesley Powell thought really a bad idea. So John Wesley Powell was a surveyor with the USGS, and in the late 1800s, he went and surveyed the Grand Canyon and throughout the American West. And he comes back to Washington and he says, you cannot settle the American West like we did the East. In the East, there's plentiful rainfall, so farming can just depend on that. You're going to have to look at irrigation to have there be farms in the American West. And what you really ought to do is organize your political boundaries based on watersheds. So the ridge lines of all the mountains and all of the water falling into a river or a lake, that should be a political entity, and you'll avoid problems down the road. If we look at the Four Corners region, it's sort of indifferent to the ecology and geography of the landscape. And when we do have borders, they tend to be in the middle of the river, not the watershed. And that's a really big problem because California, Nevada, and Arizona are sending teams of lawyers to adjudicate how that water is going to get apportioned, and it's drying up. And so we built these far-flung centralized infrastructures. So we pipe that water from the Colorado to LA or up over the Tehachapi Pass from the Owens Valley east of the Sierras to LA. We're pumping it up a 4,000-foot mountain pass and down. So 20% of the electricity and 30% of the natural gas in the state is consumed by moving water. So now, and this is called the energy water nexus. So you can't separate these things out, right? And I was listening to NPR this weekend, and they were talking about desalination plants, and that'll be the way we're going to meet future water needs for places like Los Angeles. And the issue with that is the current technology of desal consumes a ton of energy, and it also creates this slurry, which is a huge environmental problem. So are we going to make our way out of the water problem by exacerbating other problems? I think that's short-sighted. And I would also say it's utilities and construction companies that really want to build desal plants because there's a lot of money to be made. And so we're going to have a lecturer, Courtney Crossan, come from the University of Arizona, I believe April 7th. And she's actually working with her students with the city of Tucson in the middle of the Sonoran Desert to convert to net zero water. That seems crazy, but they actually don't have a whole lot of choice. They're like at the very end of the Arizona water project. Nevada's been selling water to Arizona for years. Well, Las Vegas is growing and they have less water. They want that water. And so they have to figure out a solution. So with monsoonal summer rains, winter rains, it's possible, but we have to recycle water. We can never use drinking water, quality potable water for non-potable uses. That's just a thing of the past. I came from Oregon, so some of this is going to be American West focused. I was there for many years. And in the Pacific Northwest, the climate change impacts are not as scary. So there's going to be a similar amount of precipitation as before, unlike Southern California. The issue is that it's going to come in a different form. So cities like Seattle and San Francisco are really dependent on snowpack, the snow that falls in the Cascades and the Sierras, and it slowly melts. And one thing people don't know about the Pacific Northwest, it rains all winter. It doesn't rain in the summer. So you rely on that, it's the spring snowfall and the winter snowfall, it's your like drip feed system, your crystalline reservoir to fill up the reservoirs and then draw it down for summer supply and continue to do that. But what if that is coming in the form of rain and you don't have storage capacity in your reservoirs? What are you going to do about it? And so the EPA estimates that the state of Arizona needs to spend $7.4 billion to upgrade its water distribution infrastructure. The number is over $2 billion for the city of Seattle alone. And my argument is, why would we spend that kind of money shoring up infrastructural systems configured for a climate regime that no longer exists? And that we really need to be looking at different kind of investment paradigms as the Center for Sustainable Infrastructure is advocating for. Another piece of living in the Pacific Northwest, they call it Salmon Nation. It's like the cultural symbol of that part of the country. And I've learned a lot about salmon, and just they're an indicator species for the health of the larger system. So salmon are spawned upstream in tributaries, and then they make their way down to the oceans. And that's when they get fat, and they take those nutrients and they swim upstream to where they were born, and that's where they spawn and then die. And they use the sense of smell. The trouble is, in the wintertime, it rains a lot, but in the summer, it doesn't rain. And all of the motor oils and heavy metals and this thing they just figured out, this hardening additive of tires, there's these ecotoxicological effects. The first fall rains coincide with coho salmon females that are pregnant trying to make their way upstream to spawn. And in some cases, you have 100% die-off of pregnant female salmon for the indicator species and the cultural, representative of this region. There are some forests in nutrient-poor soils in British Columbia where 20% of the nitrogen is from salmon carcasses. And these trees are like 200 feet tall. And you can't grow trees without nitrogen. It's a pretty incredible thing. So the health of the salmon is an indicator of the health of the system, but they're having a problem of moving through cities. And then we really do have to talk about water quality. And this is pretty scary. So we regulate a lot of contaminants in water. The EPA through the Safe Water Act, Clean Water Act, through something called the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. And so we can handle things like E. coli or lead when we want to, but it's unregulated chemicals, what the EPA calls chemicals of emerging concern. They're in fire retardants like baby pajamas that get washed or personal care products that turn out to be endocrine disruptors. And the biological impacts we're just starting to know. And what frustrates me very much is we produce these chemicals, they're pervasive in the environment. We find out later they're carcinogenic. What are we supposed to do about it? I would say regulate them to begin with. But this is scary stuff. My water design colleague, Brent Bucknam, I'll share his work in just a minute. But he said, again, E. coli, that doesn't worry me. We can deal with simple chemistry and biology. These contaminants of emerging concern, they're invisible and they're deadly, and they're in our water. The city of Houston, 85% of the water supply is treated effluent. So the Trinity River makes its way through Dallas, Fort Worth, other cities, makes its way to the Gulf of Mexico. Just before it reaches the Gulf, it's diverted to a reservoir. That's the most of the water supply for the city of Houston. They call it toilet to tap. Again, we regulate a lot of things, but they're personal care products and the like that are not. And then we have an enormous problem in terms of equity as the situation in Flint a couple years ago kind of brought into sharper focus. The city, there was white flight in the post-war area, people moving out suburbs. There are fewer people, a lot of Black and brown people living in the inner city. The infrastructure's aging and they couldn't afford to upkeep. So then they get a city manager to come in and we're going to switch the water supply. Well, that new water supply or that different supply had the effect of corroding the interior linings of the pipes. And so you had lead in the drinking water of children and everybody. And it's horrible. So if you want to read a tragedy, read The Poison City. It's really horrible. And there's documentation of people at the EPA emailing one another, hey, is this really the kind of city community we want to go to bat for? So David Sedlock, I've got a lot of books. I got a lot of summer reading, but the summer's over. But he's an engineer who wrote this book called Water 4.0. And if the first generation was about providing water to cities like the aqueducts of Rome, and the second was, oh, we're putting raw sewage into the Thames River in London, we have to do something about it. We have wastewater and now water treatment plants because of pollutants in the water. He's asking, what's the next generation of investments? And as part of a portfolio approach, there are multiple ways that we could think about it. I'm really interested in distributed or decentralized systems that I think are more resilient. These are biologically based systems. It's turning out, the research is coming out right now, the science, they do a much better job of removing contaminants of emerging concern than regular systems. I think it's a way to address investment paradigms, equity issues, community amenity, If conventional or centralized systems have a high environmental footprint, but they're largely invisible, these distributed systems can have a much lower environmental footprint, but could be visible in the community. And if they're visible and they're part of our community, they have to be designed. And that's where you come in. We have greater expectations for more functionality in increasingly limited urban space. So in Oregon, where I live, the Department of Environmental Quality passed a law requiring more on-site stormwater treatment. Meanwhile, the city of Portland is promoting transit-oriented development and more compact forms of development to support its affordability goals or meet its crisis. And so you have one move, which is about more porosity in the urban landscape, and the other is the opposite. So how do you address these conflicting needs? And that's a three-dimensional puzzle, and we need designers to be in the infrastructure game as a design proposition. So this upper slide is a Rotterdam-based urban design and landscape architectural practice. They're doing these water squares, and it's a sunken basketball court that doubles as stormwater storage during major rain events because nobody's shooting hoops when it's pouring rain outside. So you hold onto the water, prevent flooding upstream, slowly filter that water, let the particulates settle out, and then you know, over time when the storm subsides, that water continues on its way and you can play basketball once again. Or this is an on-site biologically based wastewater system that it'll describe in a little bit. This is something that's kind of brand new. It was a little more expensive, but they're learning that the triple safety backups they had to implement to get a permit to build this thing are not necessary. And so this is actually something that's affordable. So if you're about to embark on studio, I would really, it never fails. Like just follow the journey of water on your site. And when you start designing your building, follow the journey of water from the rooftops. And Hyphy Design Laboratory is an Oakland-based shop, and they're ecological design consultants, architectural designs. But here's a project in Louisville, Kentucky. And at the conceptual design, they're saying, where's the water coming from? The neighboring roof, there's a source, and the street runoff, there's a source, and our own roof. And we're going to gather that water, and we're going to use that water to plant plants in an atrium, and the evapotranspiration of the plants is going to produce a cooling effect. And then we're going to use that for the wastewater on-site system and for other vegetation on the site, other uses, toilets, cooling towers. And then we're going to filter that water, and we're going to use the excess water to recharge the aquifer. So buildings as part of urban landscape systems. This is a Kieran Timberlake dormitory at UCal San Diego that Hyphy was also involved in. And this site is in a floodplain. So it doesn't rain often in Southern California, but when it rains, it pours, and there's mudslides and the like. So the city said, you need to put a tank in the underground that's going to hold upwards of 2 million gallons of water during a flash flood event. And they said, why don't we just lift the building up off the ground, create a landscape that's like a sponge and capable of storing that water. It only rains, it doesn't rain very often. And for most of the year, that space can be used for students to interact and play and study and the like, socialize. And so the whole idea is we need to be moving dollars from underground utilities to the landscape and be thinking about water and infrastructure as a design opportunity. And two other Hyphy projects. This one is in a hospital in Southern California. You've got a surgery wing down low and a patient wing up above. So the recuperating patients are looking at the roof of the surgery wing. So the client said, we'd like a green roof. And the city said, that's fine, but you have to use drought tolerant natives because it's a hot, arid climate. And Brent Bucknam, who's the mad genius at Hyphy Design Laboratory, said, I think you should use water loving plants that consume a ton of water that are adapted to brackish conditions. Why would he suggest that? Where's that water coming from? It's coming from cooling towers. And there's a lot more of it in the summer than the winter. And the civil engineers trying to figure out how to get rid of it. And because of the human sweat in that water, it's salty. And so if you plant water-loving plants on the roof, you maximize evapotranspiration. You reduce the cooling load of the building by 30% for free. So again, it can help you in so many ways. It can be seismic dampening, thermal mass, sound attenuation, etc. if you bother to let it linger. And I love this notion of form follows flows or form follows chemistry, because it's not unusual for an architect to say, I want a green roof and I want a green roof. And then we ask, oh, where's the water coming from? He says, what do you have to work with? A hospital is a water hub. There's a lot of water. Why don't you take advantage of that reality, but understand its chemistry, it's salty, and we'll introduce plant communities adapted to those conditions. One other project by Hyphy, they did the living wall at the San Francisco Modern Museum of Art edition by Snow Hetta, the Norwegian architectural practice. And they wanted a living wall. Brent calls living walls ICUs, intensive care units. They take a lot of maintenance. You're far better cutting out some vine pockets, growing some vines, training them on things. Like but so for this type of project, major civic amenity makes sense. It's really beautiful, but they didn't know where the water was coming from. They calculated that on a typical visitation day, the galleries produced 1,200 gallons of condensate from human sweat, which they capture, and it's salty, and that's the water supply for the living wall. So human physiology as part of the landscape and architectural solution. I kind of like that. So we were looking in the studios I taught at the University of Oregon at, could we do net zero water in Portland? It rains a lot. And we were looking at 100 by 100 foot site in East Portland. And this is where there were a lot of low rise machine shops, beautiful Art Deco buildings. But the real estate being what it is, they're raising those and building condominiums. Sound like a lot like Charlotte to me. And so the notion of the program would be a production space down below that uses water, and then residential units above. And so I have a handy little Excel file. If you want it, you plug in climate data for Charlotte. You can tell, here's this area I have to collect. This is the amount of rainfall I can collect. And then we plotted that supply because it doesn't rain in the summer and it rains hard in the winter. So you have this trough curve. And then we calculated demand. And there are all kinds of estimates going into this, like, are we using composting toilets? Are we using, what are the end uses and what are the water qualities that we need for those uses, et cetera. But we came up with a 28.76 gallons per person per day, which is like 10 times that of much of the rest of the world, by the way. And so we plotted that, assuming irrigation during the dry summer months. So you have this curve that's the inverse. And so it turns out you have almost the exact amount of water per gallon relationship between supply and demand, which was uncanny. But the question is, do you want to store all that winter water for summer need? Because a lot of storage, it starts to get rather expensive. And so perhaps the best thing to do would be to use winter water to meet your needs and then tap into the summer city supply. But what you would do as the city grows, you're no longer taxing the overall water supply. It's level, even though the city's growing and growing. So that was the kind of balance point. Hyphy had a project in Oakland, and they were the client. It's an affordable housing project. They were really eager to do net zero, but you would have to take rainwater and convert it and use it for your wastewater system, and then turn that wastewater to potable water. And that uses a lot of energy, and membrane bioreactors, which are that wastewater technology, are expensive. So by meeting your net zero water goals, you compromise your net zero energy and your affordability goals. So it's kind of like this balance. But there's some really cool technologies coming up that are going to be much cheaper and much less energy intensive. So what this firm does is they plumb in the anticipation of those systems that should be with us in 10 to 15 years. So this is one project that came out of that studio. And the idea is we're going to plant bamboo in the highway rights of way, because bamboo, non-invasive bamboo, turns out it's the best plant in the world for removing particulates from air. So that's going to be our little contribution to the greater good. But instead of importing that bamboo, we're going to harvest it locally, bring it to a bamboo production facility on the ground floor to make furniture and cabinetry and the like. Meanwhile, we're going to capture rain from the PV cloud roof, divert it to the residential uses for gray water uses, for toilets, and also for cooling towers, other uses. And we're going to treat that water in a atrium with these stepped trays of vegetation to filter that water. And that water is going to end up on a second floor roof pond, which is going to create an acoustic buffer between the production space and the residential space. And it's going to provide evaporative cooling for the units above. And it's going to be a wellness space with like a little second floor park with yoga. And so I love this diagram okay, and so we're going to get this bamboo and we're going to sport that and clean the air. Then we're going to take the bamboo scrap and use that for biomass and radiant flooring. And then we're going to take other scrap and use it in the composting toilets. So they're actually designing in systems. And hey, I was hired as a design theorist, like, whoa, you know, aesthetics, and which I love. And I have to tell you, I've been nerding out on reversing the process and actually starting by designing systems, just trying, and not just the technology, but the kind of poetry and narrative of the system. And then again, seeing what the aesthetic, experiential, spatial opportunities are associated with that. And so this is Matt Tierney, who's a former student, dear friend, and best friends with Jonathan Desi Olive, as I learned after the search, our new hire in architecture. Amazing student. And so we've been working on these drawings and writings together. On the left, it's kind of like a riser diagram. And you'll see riser diagrams from the MEP. This is the fixtures, this is the piping, this is where it goes. And I would suggest we blow it out up and down and follow the water from the sky to the ground. Think about what the building is doing as the in-between. We're going to use that water for garden floors, for gray water, wastewater systems, and then it's going to come to the ground in different states, and we're going to deal with that. And then we're going to create a parkscape, and then we're going to infiltrate the ground. But could you just think about not the building as the system, but the building in relationship to its surroundings as the system? I worry about some of the language of sustainable architecture because we could like clad buildings in zinc and get LEED platinum. And you know what? Zinc kills fish. Like it's unbelievably toxic. So we're making decisions about the building proper, and we're not making decisions about the impacts of those choices on the broader ecosystem. So we worked with TriMet, and TriMet plans and builds and maintains public transportation in the Portland, Oregon metropolitan region, including bus lines, light rail system, and bike paths and the like. And we approached them and we said, what do you wish you had time to deal with, but you don't have time to deal with? And you know it's going to hit you like a ton of bricks in 10 years. And they said, water. Like, we have all of these impervious surfaces, parking lots and parking garages. And we know all those motor oils are just making their way to the stream. And we know we need to do something about it, but we're so caught up in the day-to-day, we just don't have time. So we said, okay, we're going to run a studio to reimagine the rest area. And in the early history of the parking garage, you not only would pay to park, but you get an oil change and tune up and car wash. So we're going to revisit this full service operation. And by the way, Mark Wilson was the ecological designer on this. This is the South Waterfront District, really contaminated soils, by the way. They built ships here during the Second World War and then dismantled them after the war. There's cobalt, there's nasty stuff in the soil. They had to remove a portion of it. Then they put a geotextile mat, the thickness of an LP record, down on the site to trap that soil. And Mark Wilson, the urban ecologist, is like, that's awesome. That's like the perfect subsurface for wetlands that the city's trying to reintroduce because they've all been filled in for real estate but they perform really critical work in terms of cleaning water and storing water during major rain events. So Mark Wilson, he climbs over fences into construction sites at night, and he does perk tests of the soil where construction equipment's been moving back and forth. And he calls the city and he goes, they've created the perfect subsurface characteristics for wetlands. All you have to do is add water. So the idea that construction processes could actually be regenerative ecological processes, that excites me. And so here's our parking garage and the system. We're going to capture water from the roof, neighboring roofs, the Ross Island Bridge, and we're going to capture that water. We're going to give the car a bath while it's there. And then we're going to aggressively step cleanse that water and time the release of that water to constructed wetlands that are part of the project development. And so in climate change, the wetlands are it's hotter and drier in the spring. So the hydro periods of the wetlands are reduced. And that means macroinvertebrates like dragonflies are having trouble reproducing because that's where they reproduce. And they're hugely important components of the trophic food chain, like for birds and fish. And so why don't we use the predictability and control of the hard surfaces of the built environment to create more dependable hydrological conditions for macroinvertebrates to complete their life cycle histories? And I'm only going to even know that's possible if I partnered with an ecologist. And I love one of my students said, you know what, it's like you're asking us to design a horse carriage 100 years ago, right when automobiles were becoming common. Like, what's going to happen to the parking garage, right? Like, I'll tell you, when I moved to Charlotte from Portland, people said it's going to be culture shock. It really wasn't culture shock. I mean, things are a little different. I'll tell you what it was parking garage shock. It blew my mind how much space in Uptown or in the South End where I live is given over to automobiles. It's crazy. It's $3,500 per space. What are you going to, when we don't need cars, hopefully in 30 years, what are you going to do with all that? And so we were actually planning for the future life. Does that remind anybody of a studio project? Have you introduced it yet? Yeah, not yet. Well, pay close attention. That's all I'm saying. And so here's a couple, like these vegetative trays would clean that water. It would also become this vertical circulation element. They actually won the Interior Design Award for the Royal Society of Arts at Cooper Union for a parking garage. That just made my day. And then one last project. This is a mechanical lift parking garage. So where real estate's at a premium, you have mechanical lifts, so you don't give too much space to ramps. And so you get out of your car, you get a car wash, it gets lifted to a drying rack, and then you go about your day. And they take the contaminated water and they run it along the south facade to grow algae. And when growing algae cleans the water, and we're going to take the harvested algae and produce biofuels, and we're going to take the cleansed water and return it to these constructed wetlands and ultimately to the Willamette River. So again, like thinking in systems, not just at the building scale, but in relationship to its surroundings. And then I mentioned this wastewater system that's new in Portland. This is the natural organic recycling machine. In Portland, it's a 4-block development. There was an existing building and they wanted 3 new projects. And the city said, the wastewater lines here are under capacity as it is. So in order to give you a permit, we're going to assess systems development charges to increase capacity. And they did the calculations and they said, it's going to be cheaper just to deal with it on site. And so that's what they created. And you can see how the system works. The lower image of the red elements are trickling filters. The water's smelly, it's contained. But what did they do? They turned a vehicular dominated street to a pedestrian street, and they made it one of the gateways to the development. So suddenly the wastewater system is part of the urban design proposition. And from there, it goes to subsurface wetlands. You don't see the water. And there's plants. but there's like organisms growing between the gravel matrix, and they eat the nutrients from the wastewater. And so you fill it up and feed the bugs, lower it, starve the bugs, feed the bugs, starve the bugs. And that's how the system works. And then they save 7 million gallons of water a year. And they use that water for cooling towers, toilets, landscape irrigation, and they return the excess to the aquifer. And again, I just love the idea that water infrastructure is part of the urban design move as we expect more out of increasingly limited space. So further on down the pedestrian path are stormwater basins, and they plant equisetum or horsetail, and there's ground level residential. So the stormwater basins serve as the spatial threshold between the public way and the private domain. And that's what we need to do, like not 20 things that do 20 things, but 3 things that do 20 things. That's how we have to be thinking about architecture. So that's what gets me to the Drawdown and the book by Paul Hawken. And once again, we're using military metaphors. Joe Skillen, chair of music, and I were talking about this just a few minutes ago. But drawdown means, again, what are the 100 things that we can do to ameliorate the worst of climate change impacts? Number 1 is refrigerants, and number 2 is women's education. And it goes on and on and on. And I also feel like there's contemporary cultural theorists who are just looking at the issues that we're dealing with, whether it's waste siege in the Palestine, amazing book, by the way, like all the trash is getting dumped in the Gaza Strip, and people like, what do you do with these contemporary realities? The mushroom at the end of the world is this beautiful story about the Matsusaki mushroom, which used to grow in Japan, but then they cut down all the trees, and now it shows up in Oregon, and Cambodian refugees living in trailers are harvesting that to send that back to Japan to sell really expensively in restaurants. But it's just like even these little things are connected to this broader system. And then Catherine Yusoff is going to give a lecture in March, and she talks about the history of the very notion of Anthropocene and the racism inherent to certain interpretations of that idea. So I've been riffing on the idea of evolutionary urbanism, and evolutionary means washing the body of part of it. And I'm thinking about people and hygiene, but I'm also thinking about polluted urban neighborhoods and cities and having there be higher quality water, and really a kind of a tactical approach to the city, not a massive master plan. We're gonna do all this stuff, but we're gonna identify strategic places within the city to intervene in. That's gonna do a whole lot of good. And I would include water infrastructure in this conversation. That's a park in Queens on the lower left, which is a parking lot turned into a stormwater basin. Or Fido is a book by Kate Kennan and Niall Kirkwood, and Kate Kennan will be giving a talk here later this semester, or I think so, later this semester. And so her argument, like I'm telling you, architecture students right now, you will be working on a site at some point where the soils are really messed up because of bad mistakes made years ago, because we made things out of chemicals we probably should have never used in the first place. And so it's not like a greenfield site where you're trying to minimize impact. You're actually trying to maximize positive change. And so even thinking about remediation of soils as part of the design process. So I'm going to go to one example, and this is the last thing I'm going to show. I know we're running out of time here, but I've been working in Egypt the last 7 years in Cairo. And you can see the Nile River and then the Nile Delta. And if you see the gray on the right where the river meets the delta, that's the Cairo metropolitan area, 22 million people. And they are more dependent on one water source than any country in the world. Ethiopia is just south, is the source of the Blue Nile, which is 90% of the volume of the Nile. And the Chinese just financed the Grand Renaissance Dam because their population's spiking and they need more arable land, but that means the Nile is getting lower. The Mediterranean up above is rising. There's saltwater intrusion on the Delta. They're converting farms to aquaculture really quickly. The temperatures are scary. We have a refugee crisis. I mean, there's a whole lot going on. Unemployment rates skyrocketed after Arab Spring. I was on the rooftop of my colleague's building just looking down, and this is typical afternoon in the life of the people who live in this very poor neighborhood, smoking the hookah, reading the Quran. Population growth is off, projections are steep. This is an amazing image. This Princeton scholar mapped Arab Spring uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt and Syria and other places to the cost of grain. And there were a whole lot of other factors involved, but there's a strong correspondence between the spike of the cost of grain and social unrest. And by the way, with Ukraine and the inability to export grain, they're saying Egypt's going to run out of it potentially in a couple months. And so you have something like this happen, Arab Spring. And my dear Egyptian friends say it was this beautiful moment in their lives because they had never before even had an idea that democracy could be a part of their future. And here they are. But it went a little bit sideways, and Sisi's the military dictator now. And his idea is to have the Chinese finance a new capital 30 miles out into the desert, which is happening. And that way, if there's another thing like this, let it happen and we'll just put a big wall around this and you guys can do whatever you want. But they've really honestly neglected the city of Cairo. So here's Cairo with the Nile running through it. And look at that square right there. If you can see that tan squarish shape, just keep an eye on that for a second. And so here you have some images, like those are the Pyramids of Giza, and we have these images of them out in the desert, but they're actually close to the city and typical housing. That's actually a relatively high-end neighborhood in the lower right there. And what's happening, this wonderful article by Wabi, there's the piped water infrastructure is broken. And so people in gated communities build their own systems, but the urban poor are trying to figure out what to do. So there's that square. That's the Mosque of Ibn Tulun that was built in 879. And this is the neighborhood where my colleague May and her team work. So they operate out of the Saliba house to the north. And then they're restoring these shrines along al-Khalifa Street. And then that orange rectangle is a vacant strip of land that's relevant to this story. So this team combines urban design, architecture, heritage conservation, community development, and the arts. It's a beautiful thing, and it's actually reminiscent of some of the fields that we have in this college. We need to be working with more, our colleagues. So there's May, and that's Kareem, who works with migrants from Syria on housing project. Nabil, who's an amazing professor at Cairo University. I was invited in 2015 to give a talk. Nabil invites me, and then he shows me his studio. A lot of the architecture school is doing tinted glazed skyscrapers, and they'll go work in Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi. He's trying to convince the next generation to stay, and a lot of them work in May's shop. And she is a heritage restorationist, and this is the mosque of Idris al-Shafi, who was a Shiite imam that was built centuries ago in a cemetery in which 100,000 people live. This is the kind of work she does. And there's our UNC team, Joe Skillen and Carlos Cruz, Gretchen Alterowitz, and that's my son in the middle with May. And so what she's done is we do heritage work and beautiful work, but the people in this really poor community are like, well, that's nice, but how come the money's all going to that and we don't even have jobs? So they've combined that with economic development opportunities, trying to help revitalize the economy here. And they also do educational programs. And some kids, this is how they learn to read and write. And this is their building, that's the roof deck. It's just an amazing place to work and stay. And that's a view from the roof deck on the right, and you can hardly see them, but those are goats living on the roof, just to give you a sense of the craziness. And it is crazy, 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 crazy. That's the Ibn Tulun Mosque to the lower left. And this is the al-Khalifa street. And they've hired muralists to do work and do some things, but they're really wanting to do something more substantive. So when I visited Mai in 2015, she's trying to restore the dome and one other dome adjacent in the upper right. But the problem is there are these apartments uphill and they're leaky pipes, these tenement complexes. Nobody's going to fix the pipes. So we came up with this idea, what if we intercept that water before it goes to the ground levels of the shrines? It's saturating the foundations of the shrines. So it's hard to get grant money to fix the domes if the foundations are deteriorating. So we intercept the water. We ran a school, international school, and this problem is pervasive throughout Cairo and other cities in Egypt, rising groundwater in a desert because of all this leaky water. There's like astonishing quantities of it. And so we're trying to figure out a system on the lower right for treating this. And on the right, you see the park as proposed, which is a raised site above the street across from the shrines. And then below, you see the plan on the right are trickling filters like we saw before, it's subsurface wetlands, and then a tank. And we were also looking at vernacular systems. And the Sabil Kutab is this unique building type in Cairo, in which this place that was for the free public dispensation of water, anybody could go get water for centuries, from like the 12th century to the 18th, before modern systems came in. But the school on the top is for orphans. And it's this beautiful idea that cultural and spiritual and water infrastructure are hybridized. And we were thinking about that, like deployed laterally, this idea of a Sabil Kutab with the water system across from the domes. And so when I was there in May with my colleagues, it was just finished. The plants have to fill in. But I mean, these kids are so poor. Their parents are so poor, and they're just running all over the place. And honestly, it's like one of the most rewarding projects I've ever been a part of. And the coolest thing is, the thing that was causing harm is rerouted, and it becomes the very resource to make a new system go. So water, like driving urban redevelopment. And again, a Sabil belongs to this charity-driven institution, which is fundamental to the Islamic ethical system. And I love the lower left because through WAQF, so a Sabil is part of the notion of WAQF, charitable dispensation. Civic essentials were provided without fear or the intervention of political power. And I only say that in this context because it's a military dictatorship and they could care less, it would seem, about the plight of these poor people. And so there's a farmer's market right down the street that we're hoping to work on next. And I love Mai's quote, and this gets to the curating urbanism and a drawdown. Like, we're not trying to have like massive solutions to massive problems. Sometimes we get into trouble, like we're going to seed the clouds to deal with climate change. And I'm sure there's no unintended consequences associated with that move. But could we solve things locally, but with a larger horizon in mind? So I just share that. So when you think about your careers, the kind of work you want to do, the allegiances you want, the partners you want to cultivate relationships with in your own discipline and others, really, I think the drawdown for me is like an ethical coming to grips with all of these changes. And what does it mean for us as a next generation of designers? Where are we going to put our passion and our energy? So with that, I think that's it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Brooke. You've given us a lot to think about, especially since even though water is fundamental to survival, we often hide it in water infrastructure in cities.
It's not part of our, it's just not part of our cultural imagination.
Yeah.
You know, it's fountains, but it's like for aesthetic flourishes. It's not something that's integral to the way that we experience the city.
So As you can see, we have 5 students here. Welcome. And Liz McCormick, professor in the School of Architecture, is going to lead them in moderating question and answer session. I have a mic. Brooke, you keep your mic, obviously. Should I give this to you, Liz, or pass it to you?
Oh, yeah. And I have to repeat the question, sorry to be redundant, for the people who are watching via the webinar.
What level you are as well.
Yeah.
Hello. Okay. I am a master's student in the M1 program, and I'm in my 3rd year. And I just wanted to start out by saying thank you so much for your insightful lecture. You mentioned in your book that architectural education lacks understanding of hydrological and hydrosocial realities. What can we as students do to fix this issue? How can we as students of architecture, especially those graduating soon, understand issues surrounding sustainability and create precedents for ourselves as we enter the workforce?
It's a great question. The question had to do with the lack of attention to water in architectural education and what things can be done to address that. Is that decent? I would say, think about water and not. So what happens, we design a building, the decisions are made, we plug it in, and then we realize after the fact that maybe it's a problem, maybe it's not. But it never fails. If I know of a studio project that many of you are going to be working on, that'll be introduced today, that's on campus, which is a large area of impervious that needs attention with a significant natural feature downstream, and all of the water is rushing into that and causing all kinds of problems. So I would think that as part of the program, the design wouldn't be simply, I have to move different, however many units of this and offices and lab spaces or whatever it might be, but what is the ecological program? And I was really lucky. Josh Serra is the chair of landscape architecture at Cornell now, but he was a project ecologist at in Portland, excuse me. And I got some grant money to bring him into the studio, not as a critic in week 8, but before the studio started, to actually write the stormwater program, to write the ecological program. So it will be part of the design statement itself, that it's helpful to have a program to know what you're to design for, as opposed to, I know I'm supposed to think about this, but I don't know how. So that if we can embed it in the very statement of the problem itself, obviously, we're going to pay more attention to it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eli. I'm a 2nd year student in the bachelor's program here. And you sort of touched on this throughout the talk, but I was wondering if you could expand on how a hydrological design philosophy can intervene into other design issues, such as public transportation, like combating car-dependent cities, affordable housing, and environmental racism.
That's a great question. So how could we think about a hydrological approach as a way to think about other needs and challenges, such as the need for better public transportation, and in the light of the reality of the many environmental injustices that are perpetrated? Well, so you know, the hydro-logical is it's actually a comment on a book that Carl Wittfogel wrote, a historian, who looked at what he called hydraulic societies. And these were societies that were very despotic and central, and they would build these vast water infrastructures, among other systems, to make the empire grow. And he compares that to something that's more hydrological, which is more ecologically responsive and more small scale, and maybe more the livelihoods of all the people oriented. So I think that approach, in terms of the scale, I mean, obviously, like the light rail extension is going to be a major project, but could we think about those places along the way? And I take the Blue Line every day. I don't have a car, and I enjoy the fact that I can live that lifestyle. But I think there were some lost opportunities and some inadvertent consequences, like housing that springs up, and we have a huge displacement problem and gentrification. So I would say, as we start thinking about and planning for the Silver Line, how can we get out in front of that and also create ecological infrastructure at these locations? So we're thinking about the intersection of art and water and air quality and other things. So I think the water can materially affect how we think about these sites, but the process overall, I think, could as well. And then we actually need to follow the money. And there's some really interesting emerging finance instruments for more equitable and more sustainable approaches to the city. They're crowdfunding buildings in Portland right now. These developers do not go to the banks because they have certain ways of going about doing things where it makes it really hard to innovate. So they go right to the building yard. Can I borrow materials? I'll pay you back. I'm getting money through crowdfunding. I'm going to pay. There's something called community investment trusts, which are really cool things. So a nonprofit bought a dilapidated mini mall in East Portland, very ethnically diverse area, very poor. And they fixed it up and they encouraged tenants, locally owned businesses to locate there. But then they can give shares out. If you live in certain zip codes, you can invest $10 a month, $100, whatever. And because some of these people are renters, they can't own a home, but they want to have some purchase, some ownership. And then once the nonprofit pays off the loan, they give the project over to the community that invested in it. So we also have to be thinking about how development works in the city if we're going to be really moving toward something that's equitable.
Hello,
You got it.
we got it, guys. Hello, my name is Nejla Harris. You can call me Nej. I'm a Master's 1 student going into my 2nd year. In chapter 4 of your book, you summarize the impact of poor water quality in the built environment. What can the occupants do to help improve the water quality in their own built environment?
I talk about water quality in chapter 4 in Concentrate and what can people do. That's a really good question. So the way I would position it, we tend to think about sustainability project by project by project. And there's a lot of things that we can do individually. But the kind of environmental history in this country is to actually think about personal lifestyle choices and individual things that we can do. And it's not so much about what we're trying to accomplish collectively. And I think, and so I'm not saying we should be conserving water and we shouldn't be putting bad things down the drain. But really, if we're thinking about a sustainable place, I think the district scale, some would argue, is the optimal scale, the community scale. Like if everything is sustainable about my building and it's net zero, it's kind of like loner sustainability where I have to solve all the problems. But the whole purpose of a city is to share resources. So if my site's high and dry, I capture sun and yours is low and wet, you capture water, we partner. And we need policies and systems in place to incentivize those kinds of partnerships. So there's this strong individualistic ethic in this country and in the way we think about environmental protection, which is wonderful and important. But we need to have a collective commitment to this in our policies, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's where we're gonna make a big difference. And building policies. That wastewater system, Portland, Oregon is the only city in the US that would permit that today. And if you look, there's a nonprofit called Recode, and they actually map sources of water and end uses. And if it's a green arrow, you can do it. And if it's a red, you can't. And so they're trying to say in this jurisdiction, these are the things that you can do. And what they're trying to do is have designers and others advocate for policy change so innovation can occur. And one of the really tricky things about water is every jurisdiction has its own rules. So I've learned something really cool in Portland, but it's of no use in a place which would never allow it, of course. So that's part of the nut we have to crack.
Hey, I'm Tommy, 3rd year undergrad. My question for you is, Gaining water as a pure resource has always been a problem to us as humans. It's not something that's new to this world, and I agree that it's something that's getting worse and probably, if it's not already, to the point of no return. And I'm curious how you think the technology aspect of it and how exactly that is capable to be transferred over to like developing regions that don't have the same resources that we do.
Right. Well, first of all, they can leapfrog and not do all the really stupid stuff we've been doing for a long time. So that, I mean, there was never phone lines, telephone poles in certain communities in Africa, whatever, and they have cell phones. But I do like in my love of water, there's these emerging technologies that I think are really exciting that are less expensive, they're smaller scale, and they're more environmentally friendly. So pervaporation is a very different approach to desalinization. And you can have one like the size of a microwave in your home. And it uses, I think, 100th the energy and produces much less brine, slurry that is a real, actually, problem for sea life, fish communities and the like. But it's a really good question that you ask. One of the amazing things about working in Egypt is you have to think very differently about how you solve problems, because we tend to think we can just throw enough technology at it. And I had a quote in this talk, and I had to remove some slides because it's too long. But Robert Young is my dear colleague at the University of Texas, and he goes, "Smart cities enable us to do stupid things faster." And I actually agree with him. Like, you know what we're going to get really good with smart cities is surveillance. It's already happening. And I don't mean to be a Luddite, but I am. But like basic questions, I think we're asking about technologies, we're not asking. So Derek Jensen, who's this radical environmental philosopher, and he's out there, but sometimes it's like it's a mind-bending experiment. And we live in the Anthropocene. That means we're the first species that's causing mass extinction, the 6th mass extinction in the history of the world, first caused by a human. And so the idea is we're like God now. We get to play God and dictate by virtue of the choices that we make about cities and planning. We get to determine which species live and which species die. And Randy Hester, who's a landscape architect at Berkeley, said to all the architects in the room, pick a species and save it, which I thought was an interesting thing to say. But basically, we get to play God and choose which species live in. Never for a moment would we think we probably shouldn't be using that technology. I mean, just think about that. Like we wouldn't even think of, it wouldn't even occur to us to like reframe our reliance to do things that would be enabling those species to survive. I think it's an ethical thing and it's a philosophical thing about how we look at the world. So I'm not anti-technology, but I will say my favorite technology of all by far is gravity. It's so dependable. It's relentless. Sorry, it's gone too far.
Hello. Yeah. Hi, I'm Lochna. I'm a MR2 second year student. So I have a broader question. What are your views on contemporary architectural education system? Do you think it restricts topics concerning global climatic issues to architectural theory more than architectural studio? In your opinion, how can it be improved to make students environmentally sensitive architectural designers than just trained architectural engineers?
So the question had to do with the extent to which architectural education is addressing climate change impacts. Is it more in the kind of theoretical continuum, or is it more practical? Is that sort of?
So sounding less scholarly, it's just when are architects not more trained to solve these issues, like learn the formulas and address these issues and more learn more it in a design context?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to perfectly answer your question, but I do think like my interest in sustainable design I think about design. And because sometimes the way sustainable architecture is communicated or represented, it's a list of features. And to me, that's features. What design is a mechanism to put all those things together. Now, when I was in school, I was hungering for more exposure to sustainable ideas, and the way that curriculum was set up, it was more Bauhaus model, where we're dealing with form and learning about compositional qualities and aesthetic things, and then we kind of layered in the sustainability. And I get like sustainable design should be really spectacular design, where an economy of means produces a richness of effect. Like fewer things do more. But we need the design skill to be able, we need design skill, and we need the practical awareness of these issues. And we need experts who know a lot about this. And we need to put our design skill and our poetic thinking caps and our analytic caps together. And that's what architecture is. This is a next evolution of it. But I think there are profound questions to be raised in terms of what are the problems that we're taking on? What are we trying to, what are we dealing with here? How are we working on, what issues are we working with? And I would say, you know, you need to have an agenda, like each of you. So of course, a professor has a studio project in mind, but architecture is a personal journey and a social act. And so you have to figure out what your strengths are, and that's part of being in a studio. But you also have to figure out, make sense of this larger sublime mess that we live in the world today. And how can you take these personal strengths that you nurture and cultivate and be part of a team setting to actually create solutions to these problems? I didn't exactly answer your question. But
Thank you.
So we have a few minutes. I'm gonna just see if we have an audience questions. Blaine has a bunch of announcements. But
Yeah.
if anybody in the audience has any questions?
They need the mic. Yes, sir.
Hello.
Hello.
So one of the questions I had was, you said that there is a lot of issues that come from trying to solve big problems with big solutions.
Yeah.
So what are some of those varying issues that you've personally came across?
Okay, so I would just say that this is a whole topic. I actually had a slide. There's a book called Seeing Like a State, who's a political scientist named James Scott wrote. And it's all these ideas of these large, massive interventions that's going to solve all the world's problems, and ended up creating as many problems, if not more, than they solve. So, for example, Egypt builds the Aswan Dam, and it did bring electricity, more arable land, a number of benefits, but it also meant that the nutrients coming down from the mountains was trapped in the reservoir and wasn't making its way to the Nile Valley. And those people used those nutrients for thousands of years to grow crops. And it also led to a population explosion. And it also led to a greater dependency on petrochemical fertilizers. And so, I don't know. I mean, so what is progress? Like what, I don't know. I mean, it's couched in the theme of progress, but there's all these unintended consequences associated with that. And so we need to be thinking outside the box to move beyond these problems. But I just sometimes, and the Aswan Dam brought many benefits, but it brought many challenges. So how can we be, as much as possible, anticipating what these consequences might be for the technological choices that we make? That's a really big thing. And so I read things about seeding the clouds to cool the temperature. Like, you got to be kidding. Like, there's going to be things associated with changing the global atmosphere that maybe won't turn out so great. Or like, you know, the whole idea we're going to move to a different planet. Like, this is the one we got, folks. Let's make it work. And I'd say there's this beautiful video called Ecology by Design. And John Todd, who's the living machines guy. You should all look at living machines, these plant-based wastewater systems. They're beautiful in communities. But he and his team were hired to do the sustainable development plan for this small town in northern Mexico. And you have, what he writes about is this team had combined centuries of education, centuries. And they said, we couldn't even figure out how to make 2 acres on this planet work with people in it. Like, how do we make this planet with more and more people work? And we're doing the opposite, and it worries me. So I think our education has to profoundly get at some really basic questions.
Yeah.
One more?
Maybe one more question.
No. Better be a good one, because I'm joking. I'm joking.
So I've kind of vented like numerous times about how far behind the country is in relation to infrastructure.
Oh my God.
I'm kind of disappointed.
Yes.
You know, I believe that we shouldn't really have to think about how the roads are deteriorating and how buildings are collapsing and bridges are collapsing.
Yeah.
One reason why I'm focused on architectural law is to improve the infrastructure, because there's so many targeted areas that need improving in relation to how far behind we are in such as like places like Tokyo and Dubai, where the infrastructure is off the charts. And we're kind of, as the wealthiest country in the world, we're kind of behind in that. So what would your current view on America's infrastructure be in certain bullet points? Like our present infrastructure phase at this moment?
Yep, it's an excellent, phenomenal question. And I have similar experience. I go to Spain, public trains get you everywhere. I lived in Germany for 4 years. You would take a train to Berlin from Stuttgart, where I live. It's supposed to get in at 12:10, and you step off the platform and the second hand is clicking and it's 12:10. It's like, it's not only on time to the minute, that's very German, by the way. Whereas the Amtrak, if you arrive the same day, I think that's a victory. And it just shows you what we're thinking of in terms of the collective good of the society. Now, I showed a slide of the Center for Sustainable Infrastructure, and Reese Ross is the executive director, and they have these really cool reports on infrastructure, water, energy, waste, and you can download them for free. And what they're really talking about is because people think about money, these investment paradigms. And so looking at distributed water infrastructure in Seattle versus spending $2 million on the centralized system, it's more resilient, it's more equitable, it's more beautiful, it's more environmentally friendly, a lot more. And it's also, in the end, it's a lot cheaper. And so he's actually convinced the more progressive side of the aisle and the much more conservative side of the aisle that this is the way to go. So I hate that everything has to have a dollar attached to it, but I think we can show that that these things make sense in a whole lot of ways. One last example, Peter Calthorpe is an architect in San Francisco. He was hired to look at the Wasatch Basin where Salt Lake City is. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. And it's growing like crazy, and they have inversion effects in air quality. And they did this massive survey of like 40,000 people. What do you value? And they had different things ranked. You want clean water, clean air, good schools, big house, whatever. Turns out everybody would like to have clean water and clean air and good schools more than pretty much anything else. And so then they ran some different growth models. If you do low development sprawl, this is what happens to your air and water in school. If you do more high density, and they actually convinced a very conservative legislature and governor and mayor to build the tracks, which is the new light rail line. And so it's partly how we frame these things up, but it's partly a cultural crisis, I would say. One of my favorite books is called Technology and the Character of Contemporary Life by this philosopher named Albert Borgman. And one of the things he says is in Western liberal societies like ours, there's a refusal to have a conversation as to what constitutes the shared good life as a community, as a society. Like you have your idea of good life, it's life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. You have your means and your end in mind, and I've got mine, and I'm going about my business, and you've got more means than I, and you have different ends or whatever. But when are we like ever talking about the place where the world we want to create collectively? And that's something that's getting worse and woefully lacking in this country. It's so individualized, and I buy into individuals, you know, at some level, but I think we got enough people in this country. I think we need to start shaping our discourse with one another very differently. It's my own opinion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brooke, thank you so much. And I'd like to thank Liz McCormick and our esteemed panelists. Thank you for your questions. So as we transition to our next phase, we do have some announcements. As Liz mentioned, I'll change the presentation. In the meantime, anyone who's not anyone who's not School of Architecture student, faculty, or staff, you are welcome to stay. But the next part of our convocation is to talk about School of Architecture announcements. So you don't have to stay if you don't want to. Is there something I have to do the mouse and do next? No,
it just wasn't a no, but it should be good.
Okay. First of all, I would love to welcome 4 new full-time faculty members. And if you're in the space, I see some are in the space, maybe all, you could stand or raise your hand when I call your name. Some are already standing. So Jonathan Desi Olive, new assistant professor in technology and design. Over here, Julio Diarte is a visiting scholar in technology and design, right there. Matthew Jen, assistant professor in architectural history in the back. Elena Vasquez Pena, research fellow, right there, technology and design. Welcome to you all. And I'd also like to welcome new and returning part-time faculty members. Kuniko Buford will be joining us in third-year studio. I don't know if Kuniko is here, but she will be here. Ashkan Radnia, computational design specialist, will be teaching one of our sections of computational methods. And Okyun Im is not new to us as a research fellow, but is new as a part-time faculty member. So he'll be helping with building systems integration. And I would also like to welcome back returning part-time faculty in the classroom, Alex, Arturo, Fernando, Carol, Mackenzie, David, and David. We also have 3 new staff members in alphabetical order here. Anissa Lee is an admissions assistant, Daniela Newbill, office manager, and Bridget Stipasevic, executive assistant in the School of Architecture front office. I will say, just learned that Daniela is moving on to be an executive assistant for, I think it's an associate vice chancellor of facilities management. So she's already been promoted away. Congratulations to Daniela. It's hard to be, I mean, I'm happy for her, a little sad. It's true that our staff are that good. We like to hold on to them if we can, and hopefully these staff will be here to support all of you. So this is our staff lineup currently, and we'll certainly share more information. You've heard from several of these folks already. If you're new and haven't met our staff members, please stop by and introduce yourselves and get to know them. They make everything run as smoothly as it does. I also want to congratulate 3 faculty members who recently successfully passed what we call the RPT process at various stages. And so Rachel Dickey, who's they're all faculty members here. Rachel Dickey successfully got tenure and promotion to associate professor. Kyung-hee Kim, who was associate professor with tenure, was promoted to full professor, and Liz McCormick successfully passed her reappointment as an assistant professor. So very proud of them. Next, talking about upcoming events and announcements, updates. You've seen this poster. I would again invite you to look a little bit more at each of our upcoming speakers and see if you want to get involved. I've invited our faculty to consider if there are any potential curriculum tie-ins or event tie-ins. Our student organizations, please also think about things you can do if you'd like to host our guest speakers for an event, or we'll be coordinating things like meals, etc. So it should be really fun. I do note that Kate Kennan is coming in March. I was wrong. So, but this is the final lineup. So please refer to this. Our next speaker is Esther Ebonyo, Director of the Global Building Network and Associate Professor of Engineering Design and Architectural Engineering at Penn State University. And her lecture will be Friday, September 30th. And all of the lectures from this point on will be at 12:30, so that you'll have time to get to studio on time at 2. Okay, here's some events, upcoming events on the calendar. I'm very excited that we'll welcome Dr. Sarah Lewis. This will be a college-wide event. She originally, we wanted to host her this week, but she has some event with Oprah. So she was very kind to pencil us in, but this distinguished lecture should be really an incredible event. And you can see some other things coming up. We're trying also to maintain, continue, even increase the frequency of some of our culture building events, recognizing that with us being mostly remote over the last couple of years, it was a little bit hard to build that community at times. And we really want to rebuild in many ways the really strong community that is a highlight and a hallmark of this school. There have been some events already, like the pizza welcome, a new grad orientation, lawn party, and you'll hear more from the student organization leaders today about things like the barbecue this Friday. So just stay tuned for more details. And it is now my pleasure to welcome Wendy Fishman, who is Director of Collaborative Works, or maybe to raise her hand or something. Are you going to stand back there? Okay, that's Wendy Fishman. If you don't know her, please. She's very cool. She comes from the film industry originally. She was a location scout for Homeland. You ever seen the Homeland series? I think I saw your name in the IMDb database. She's still sort of a film person, but anyway, Wendy's Director of Collaborative Works and engaged with our museums and local institutions of the arts and culture. She has stickers for all of your student IDs. If you're returning students, please see her and you can put a sticker on your ID, and then you would have free admission for this year. Thanks to the college. The college is supporting this admission. If you're new students and you have an electronic pass, we're still trying to figure out how that works, but please still take a sticker and put it on your phone case or something, and right, Wendy? We'll figure that out. Okay. Anything else? No, it's all good? Okay, great. Thank you so much to Wendy and the college for making that possible. Yeah. Oh, what museum? Harvey B. Gantt Museum. Did you everyone hear that? Met in the Beckler and the Harvey B. Gantt Museum. So all incredible destinations if you haven't visited them before. And accessible via the light rail. Go downtown, uptown. Thank you. On the theme of travel and seeing things, we're also thrilled to promote and return to this tradition of getting out and seeing places. And our faculty are passionate about leading students on field trips, study abroad. These are field trips that will occur this year, destinations. Various cohorts will go to Chicago, Seattle, New York, and Washington, D.C. It's the second years will go to Chicago. The third year students get to go to Seattle. The urban design students and one of the fourth year studios to New York, and first years in the spring to Washington, D.C. So you should hear from your faculty's studio coordinator about your trip. And further afield, we have these options for this year. So Jeff Ballmer will lead the Rome and Istanbul experience. It's a full semester experience this spring semester. And Chris Jarrett we're fingers crossed we can go to Japan, folks. It's been hard for tourists to get to Japan, but this would be a summer session 1 trip to Tokyo for architecture students and other parts of Japan. Nadia Anderson leading for a second time urban design students during summer session 1 to San Juan and other parts of Puerto Rico. And Nadia is also eager to invite other students. If you're an architecture student, not necessarily urban design student, please see Nadia if you're interested in going to Puerto Rico. So these are really exciting trips. It's part of our mission to really engage international and different communities, also different regional communities within this nation, but just to make you better global citizens and increase intercultural competence. I don't think I've started a semester without addressing infectious diseases in some way for the last 3 years. So why would I now? But in all seriousness, we do. I mean, it's great that we don't have the same kind of levels of protocols and fears and restrictions that we've had in the past, but we do have to be careful. And so with COVID-19 and now with monkeypox, hopefully you've received information that answers any questions you have from the university. When in doubt, you can go to the Niner Nation Cares website to answer your questions. You probably saw my email this morning, but here's some basic steps for prevention, what to do if you have symptoms, and what to do if you're diagnosed. And if you have any questions, please come see the staff, see me. We want to maintain high health standards and make sure everyone's safe and healthy. Okay, so one of my favorite parts of this this convocation talk is welcoming the leaders of our student organizations. We have incredible organizations. I will briefly talk about them and invite their leaders up to give you some more updates that are specific to the organizations. So for American Institute of Architecture students, Olivia Meyer will speak about upcoming events. Our National Organization of Minority Architecture Students had as its president, as I understand, Victor Cunningham, but I think there's now an opening for the presidency. I'm not really sure. But that's our NOMAS organization is one that's been really active and thriving, and we definitely want to collaborate with you. And so if anyone's interested or perhaps knows about the leadership slate, please let us know. Freedom by Design, Alan Tucker will speak, and Jessie Cart will speak about critical mass. And she has also prepared some slides to talk about what I pronounce as WISE, Women in Architecture Students group. It's a new group that we're piloting this year, which should meet a lot of important needs to address challenges, issues, opportunities that affect women in architecture. And also, we also have a U.S. Green Building Council student organization. I'm awaiting word on who is leading that. And if no one, then please let me know if you're interested in leading that organization as well. So with that, I will welcome Olivia to talk about AIAS.
Hi, so yeah, my name is Olivia Meyer. I'm a third year undergrad student and I'm excited to be your AIAS president for this year. So for those of you who don't know, AIAS is the American Institute of Architecture Students. We are a national organization that helps architecture students around the country prepare for their professional future. So the mission statement from the national website is our hope, like we hope to advance leadership, design, and service among architecture students. But what that means for us as a chapter is that we get to host very fun events in hopes to further your professional education. So we host various things like interview preparation as well as portfolio help. We're hoping to increase our involvement in peer mentorship, and we have a close connection with AIA Charlotte, being the professional aspect of AIAS. And we also offer a few scholarships, and we go on firm tours around Charlotte, as well as sometimes we get to visit other architecture schools in our region and connect with those students around the South here. For conferences, we actually have two conferences. We just came back from Grassroots, which happened in DC, which was a 4-day leadership conference, and we had a great time out there. And then we also host some more casual but just as fun events, like the international food potluck, the t-shirt competition, pumpkin carving, and the Mario Kart competition is coming back. We also have like a professor auction and a back to school barbecue, which Blaine mentioned briefly before. Is it just a clip or? Okay, so yeah, this is the whole list of the current board members, and we're all super excited to work with you and for you to have a successful year. We're kind of scattered all over the building, so if you see us in the hall, don't hesitate to stop and say hi or ask us any questions. But yeah, we're super excited. So with the back to school barbecue, that is happening this Friday, right outside of the first year studio area. So with that, we're going to be having barbecue food like pulled pork and double the amount of mac and cheese that we had last year, so it won't run out. But we'll also be having different yard games and music, and it'll be a really fun time, a great way to interact with people in your own class, as well as get to know people in classes above you and below you. And then also as another incentive, if that doesn't sound cool enough, if you ordered a t-shirt from the t-shirt competition last year, you'll also take this opportunity to hand out those t-shirts at this event. So make sure you stop by to get the t-shirts and stay for the food and the cornhole and stuff like that. So yeah, we're excited. Thanks.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Alan Tucker. I'm the director for Freedom by Design this year. We're the ones that actually get our feet on the soil. And Elaine told me I have 2 slides. So I decided just to make the first one a dog that I sat recently. Can we just have a quick round of applause for all the dogs in the world? Okay. So I'm not just going to waste my time up here. I will talk about our events. So as Olivia mentioned, this Friday, we do have our back to school barbecue. Definitely come to that. Sometime in October, we're going to be having what's called our Black Line Ball. It's going to be a dance. There's more info coming out soon. And in late November, I'm going to have CAPS come out and talk to us about mental health. That's also something I'm very excited about. Keep in tune on social media. Our Instagram is FBDUNCC, or just keep an eye out for advertisements around the school. Okay, thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jessie Cart. I'm in the dual degree master's program. So I just finished my master's of urban design and I'm in the M2. So I am the president of the Master of Architecture Student Society, which is very critical. We have two main purposes. One is to get together once a month for critical beer. We typically will meet at a brewery that's accessible via the light rail, hang out, get to know each other, vibe off campus. And then our other big thing is putting on Critical Mass, which is our academic symposium that gets put on every single year in the spring. It's been going on for about 20 years, which is really exciting and a lot of fun. It's an opportunity for graduate architecture students who are in their diploma or thesis studio from across the country to get together, share their work, and receive feedback from a panel of critics. We also always invite a distinguished critic to come and also present a lecture. This past year, we had Mark Foster Gage. It's a lot of fun. Critical Mass is super low key, but we are looking for officers. So if you are interested in joining this super fun, low key team, please let me know. I'll be sending out an email probably later this afternoon. So if you want to be one of these folks, feel free to reach out, follow us on social media. We also have a website and an email. And then, like Blaine mentioned before, we are going to be starting a Women in Architecture student group. So the mission of this group is to increase the visibility and voices of women in architecture, to bring awareness to the gender disparity within the profession, as well as empower women architects to grow, succeed, and become leaders in the industry. So we want to support and cultivate a really positive representation of women within school, within architecture. We want it while building a strong community and advancing gender equity within design. One of the reasons why this is really important, it's been a conversation that a lot of people have been having over the past few years, is that within the field of architecture, while 50% of the students do identify as female, only 17% of licensed architects are women, which is a huge misrepresentation and, you know, super not that great. But WISE will be open to all gender identities. We'll be encouraging things such as intersectional dialogue. So anyone is welcome to join, grads, undergrads, anybody. And we are also looking to build a board. So if you are interested, please reach out to me. And you don't need any experience. We don't need anything like that. We just want to build a really strong, really great team. So if you're interested in joining, helping out, and starting this really cool organization, please let me know.
Thank you all so much. This is a lot of exciting stuff to look forward to. And another way you can get involved as a student is to be a student representative. Here are some of the kind of roles of student representatives. So what we'll do is elect, your cohorts will elect 2 representatives for each of your year levels. And I will have the great privilege of meeting with the elected student representatives regularly, just to kind of check in about important matters. Mental health, which Alan mentioned, is a huge concern, something that we want to really encourage, positive mental health and make sure everyone's doing well and attending to all the other kind of matters that come up. So please put your name forward if you are interested in being a student representative. If at any of these kind of levels, I've listed faculty coordinators you can reach out to and indicate your interest, or if you want to nominate a classmate, please let these faculty members know, and they will organize a voting process so that we can form that essentially a kind of committee to meet throughout the year. And this concludes the convocation ceremony today. Thank you all for being here. I'm super thrilled about the year and excited to see what you all do. Thank you.